The letter hit the floor of Cornelius Ramsey's cabin like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples it sent through him were violent enough to crack something he had spent 3 years keeping carefully sealed. She was leaving. Stella Turner, the woman he had traded every last pelt from a full season's worth of trapping, beaver and fox and mink and wolf, stacked so high at the trading post in Fort Laramie that old Herschel Webb had whistled low and said he'd never seen a single man bring in that kind of haul. That woman was packing her trunk and booking passage on the first eastbound stagecoach out of Cutter's Creek, Wyoming Territory, and she had not said a single word to his face about it. He had found out from the blacksmith's wife. Cornelius stood in the center of his one-room cabin, the letter crumpled in his massive fist, his jaw so tight it could have bitten clean through a rifle barrel. Outside, the October wind came screaming off the Medicine Bow Range and threw itself against the log walls like it wanted inside. He didn't feel it. He felt nothing except the specific, catastrophic sensation of a man who has bet everything on a single card and watched the dealer flip it face down. He had paid for her passage west, not just the stagecoach from Kansas City, all of it. The train from Philadelphia to Kansas City, the accommodations at the way station in Abilene, the letter that Reverend Calhoun had sent to the Women's Placement Agency on his behalf, the agency fee itself. Every penny of it had come from those pelts. A season's worth of cold, of solitude, of waking before dawn and checking traplines in water so icy his hands had stopped feeling pain and started feeling something closer to prayer. He had done all of that so that Stella Turner could come west and have a life that was something more than the servant's position she had been filling in Philadelphia since her parents died. And now she was leaving. He picked up his coat, shoved his arms through it, and stepped out into the wind. The town of Cutter's Creek was not much of a town. It had a main street of packed dirt that turned to mud every spring and froze solid every winter, a general store, a saloon, a livery, a barber shop that doubled as the dentist's office, a church, and 37 permanent residents, more or less, depending on the season and the sobriety of certain individuals. It sat at the edge of the Wyoming basin like something the mountains had shrugged off their shoulders, and it was, as Cornelius had once described it to the woman he intended to bring here, rough but honest. He had meant it as a recommendation. He wondered now if she had taken it as a warning. He found Stella Turner at the stagecoach office, which was also the post office and the land surveyor's front room, speaking in a low, controlled voice to a red-faced man named Gerald Prout, who served as both the postmaster and the stagecoach booking agent for this portion of the territory. She had her back to the door when Cornelius came through it, and she was dressed in her good blue wool dress, the one she had worn to church every Sunday since she arrived in September, 6 weeks ago. Her dark hair was pinned up under a traveling bonnet. She had a leather travel bag sitting at her feet. "Stella," she went still. She did not turn around right away, and in the 3 seconds it took her to do it, Cornelius watched Gerald Prout's eyes go very wide and then slide sideways toward the door in the manner of a man calculating his exit options. When Stella turned, her face was composed in a way that cost her something. He could see the price of it in the slight tension around her mouth, in the way her dark eyes met his and held steady through what appeared to be considerable effort. "Cornelius," she said, "you want to tell me what is happening here?" It was not a question. His voice was very quiet, which was how people in Cutter's Creek had learned to recognize when Cornelius Ramsey was not calm. "I was going to come speak with you," she said, "before or after the stage left." The color in her cheeks deepened. Gerald Prout made a small, decisive movement toward the back room, and neither of them stopped him. He was wise enough to disappear completely, pulling the inner door shut behind him with a click that sounded very loud in the silence. Stella lifted her chin. "I wrote you a letter. I found it on the floor. The wind took it under the door before I had the chance to read it properly." He crossed the small room in 3 strides and stood in front of her, close enough that he could see she had been crying recently, though she had cleaned her face and she was not crying now. Her eyes were steady and her chin was up, and God help him, even furious and hurt and braced for some kind of betrayal he couldn't yet name. He thought she was the most remarkable-looking woman he had ever seen in his life. He had thought that the first time he saw her step off the stagecoach from Abilene. "Tell me why," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, and something shifted behind her eyes, some internal door she had been holding closed swinging open an inch. "Because I cannot be what you need me to be," she said, "and staying would be a cruelty to us both." He stared at her. "You have been here 6 weeks. 6 weeks is enough time to know." "Know what exactly?" She pulled in a breath. "That you didn't bring me here because you wanted a partner, Cornelius. You brought me here because you wanted someone to fill a space, to make the cabin less silent and the winters shorter. I understand that. I don't blame you for it. But I have secrets of my own and a past that would not sit well in a town this small, and I think you deserve better than what I would be bringing through your door." He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind gusted hard enough to rattle the single glass window of the stagecoach office. "What secrets?" he said at last, and that was where it really began. To understand how Cornelius Ramsey came to be standing in the Cutter's Creek stagecoach office in October of 1874, facing down a woman who was trying to flee before he could fall any further in love with her, you had to go back to a cold February morning in that same year, when he had walked into Herschel Webb's trading post with a load of pelts that had taken him all autumn and half a winter to accumulate. Cornelius was 31 years old that February. He had lived in the Wyoming Territory for 9 years, arriving in 1865 at the age of 22, fresh out of 3 years of fighting in the war that had aged him considerably beyond his years. He had come west for the same reason most men did, which was that the East no longer felt habitable, and the mountains offered the specific kind of solitude that passes for peace when a man cannot afford the real thing. He had trapped and hunted and built his cabin with his own hands on a stretch of land northeast of what would become Cutter's Creek, and he had been, by most external measures, doing fine. He was not fine. He was lonely in the specific, grinding way that a man becomes lonely when he has decided, consciously or not, that he does not deserve company. He spoke to almost no one except Herschel Webb at the trading post, and occasionally to the Arapaho trader named Running Elk who came through the territory in spring and autumn, and who had taught Cornelius more about trapping and tracking than any white man ever had. He ate what he could hunt and grow. He went to church on Christmas and Easter because it was what his mother would have wanted. He read every book he could get his hands on because books did not require him to explain himself. And then, on that February morning, standing at Herschel's counter, while the old man sorted through his pelts with the careful, appraising hands of a man who had been doing it for 40 years, Cornelius had seen the notice pinned to the board near the door. It was put out by a women's placement agency in Philadelphia, the kind of operation that existed in the 1870s to help women of limited means find respectable situations in the West, whether as housekeepers, teachers, or, with the appropriate social arrangement and the blessing of a local minister, as wives. The notice was practical in its language and careful not to make promises that couldn't be kept. It described the agency's process, its standards, its fees. At the bottom, in smaller print, were 2 sentences that Cornelius read 3 times before he turned away from the board. "We place educated women of good character in positions of dignity and mutual benefit. We believe the West is large enough for lives that begin again." He had stood there at Herschel's counter for a long time after that, long enough that Herschel looked up from the pelts and said, "You all right, Cornelius?" "How much?" Cornelius had asked. "For the lot, I'd say $94. It was more than enough for the fees. It was more than enough for train passage from Philadelphia to Kansas City and stagecoach passage from Kansas City to Abilene, and from Abilene to the Territory." Cornelius had walked out of the trading post 2 hours later, having arranged with Herschel to hold the money against the account, having visited Reverend Calhoun's church, and persuaded the Reverend to write the necessary letter of character. And having committed himself to something that felt simultaneously like the most reckless and the most reasonable decision he had made in 9 years, he did not tell anyone he had done it. He went back to the mountain and trapped all spring, the remainder of that winter, and all of the following autumn, building the second season's hall that would serve as his reserve. He wrote a letter to the agency. The agency wrote back. There were several exchanges of formal, carefully worded correspondence, the agency's letters written in a neat, precise hand that he would later learn belonged to Stella Turner herself, who had been employed at the agency as a letter writer and placement coordinator for 2 years before becoming, in the natural course of events, one of its placements. He would not learn that until later. What he learned from the letters was that she was 26 years old, that she had been educated at a women's academy in Philadelphia before her parents' deaths had made further schooling impossible, that she could read and write in English and French, that she could cook and sew and keep accounts, that she had no living family, and that she was, in her own words, prepared to work hard and expect nothing easy. He had written back, "I don't have much to offer except the land and honest company. I won't pretend otherwise." She had written, "Honesty is rarer than you think." That exchange had done something to him that he did not have immediate language for. He had read her response 4 times on the night it arrived, and then set it on the shelf above his fireplace where it stayed until the shelf held 7 letters, which was the full extent of their correspondence before she arrived. He had been nervous the morning of her arrival in a way he had not been nervous about anything since the war, which was not a comfortable comparison. He had put on his good shirt, which he had purchased specifically for the occasion, and ridden into Cutter's Creek 2 hours early and walked the length of the main street several times, which the blacksmith's wife, a sharp-eyed woman named Dora Hutchins, had noted with visible amusement. The stagecoach had arrived 40 minutes late, which was actually early by the standards of that particular route. Stella Turner had stepped down from the coach with a leather travel bag and a medium-sized trunk, and the composed expression of a woman who had made a decision, and intended to see it through regardless of what she found waiting at the other end of it. She was of medium height and dark-haired, and had the kind of face that did not announce itself loudly, but stayed with you afterward. Her eyes were very dark, almost black in certain light, and they assessed things quickly and without obvious judgment, which was a quality Cornelius recognized because he had cultivated something similar in himself. She had looked at him, all 6 feet and 2 inches of him, with his beard and his scarred hands and his good shirt that didn't quite fit his shoulders correctly, and said, "You must be Cornelius Ramsey." "I am," he had said. "I'm Stella Turner." "I know." There had been a brief pause in which both of them seemed to be taking stock. Then she had said, "The mountains are larger than I expected," and he had looked behind him at the Medicine Bow Range rising above the basin like a wall of stone and sky and said, "They tend to be," and somehow, inexplicably, they had both almost smiled. He had taken her to meet Reverend Calhoun as the arrangement required to confirm the formalities of the situation. The plan, as agreed through correspondence with the agency, was a 6-week period of what the Reverend called getting acquainted, after which, if both parties were willing, a proper marriage could be performed. If either party was unwilling, Cornelius would see to it that Stella had funds for passage to wherever she wanted to go, and no one was obligated to anything. That had been 6 weeks ago, and now here they were in the stagecoach office, and she was telling him she had secrets. He took off his hat and set it on the corner of Gerald Prout's desk and looked at her directly. "Tell me what they are," he said. "Not because you owe me anything. Tell me because you said honesty is rarer than people think, and I believe you meant that." She looked at him for a long time, and then she looked at her travel bag sitting on the floor between them, and then she made a decision he could see pass across her face the way weather passes across open land. "Can we sit down somewhere?" she said. They walked to the general store, which had a small room in the back with a table and 2 chairs where Eli Marsh, who owned the store, sometimes conducted business. Eli was a decent man who understood the difference between being helpful and being nosy, and he let them in without asking questions. The room smelled of coffee and sawdust and old paper, and a small iron stove in the corner pushed out enough heat to make it almost comfortable. Stella sat down across from Cornelius and folded her hands on the table. He noticed, not for the first time, that her hands were not the soft hands he might have expected from a woman who'd grown up in cities. They were capable hands, the hands of someone who had done real work. "I was married before," she said. He held still. "In Philadelphia when I was 21. His name was Edmund Turner. That's why I kept the name, because by the time he was gone there was nothing else left. He took everything else." She paused. "He was not a good man. I don't say that lightly. But he was educated and he was charming, and I was 21 and just lost my parents, and he seemed like solid ground." Another pause, shorter. "He was not solid ground." Cornelius said nothing. He was listening in the way he listened to the mountain, which was completely. "He had debts I didn't know about," Stella continued. "Gambling debts and others. When he died, he was shot in a card game, which tells you what kind of man he was. He left me nothing but those debts and a name I had already decided wasn't worth keeping. Except that the agency found it easier to place women with a proper surname, so I kept it." She lifted her eyes to his. "I am a widow, Cornelius. The agency knew. The Reverend knew. I should have told you directly instead of letting them handle it, and I'm sorry for that. That's one secret. And the other," he said. She drew in a breath through her nose. "The other is that I was not employed at the agency simply as a placement. I helped run the correspondence because I was good at it, and because Mrs. Garrett, who owned the agency, was kind to me. But I was also, myself, one of the women on the books, which means that the person who wrote you all those letters was also, in a professional sense, doing her job. And I have been sitting with the fear that you would one day feel that was a form of deception. That I presented myself in those letters as a stranger, as a disinterested party, when in fact I was the one who read your letter first, who chose to respond, who shaped the correspondence from both sides." She looked at him without flinching. "I was not dishonest in anything I wrote. Every word was true. But I was not fully transparent, and I think you deserve to know the shape of the thing you were entering into." The stove popped and settled. Outside, the wind was still running hard down the mountain, but in here it was just sound. Cornelius looked at his hands on the table, then at hers, then at her face. "You chose to respond to my letter," he said, "out of all of them." "Yes." "Why?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because you said you wouldn't pretend. Most men pretend. They describe themselves as prosperous when they mean they have a piece of land. They describe themselves as established when they mean they have a cabin. They talk about opportunity and frontier spirit and the promise of the West, and what they mean is that they need someone to cook and clean and be quiet. You said you had honest company to offer." Her voice dropped slightly. "I have been around a great many people in my life. Honest company is not something to dismiss." He felt something shift in his chest. Something that had been positioned defensively for a very long time moved, not all the way, but enough to notice. "And the running," he said. "What is that about if what you've told me is the whole of it?" She looked down at the table for the first time. "I'm not running from you," she said. "I'm running from what I think might happen if I stay." "And what is that?" "I think I might." She stopped, started again. "I think the danger, Cornelius, is not that I would be unhappy here. I think the danger is that I would be very happy here, and that frightens me more than the other thing." He stared at her. "My husband died and I was not sorry," she said, very quietly. "I was relieved, and then I was ashamed of the relief, and then I spent 4 years making certain I would never put myself in a position to be either of those things again. And now I am sitting in a back room in Wyoming Territory across from a man who traded an entire season's worth of furs to bring me here, and who has been nothing but decent and careful with me for 6 weeks. And I am realizing that somewhere in those 6 weeks I stopped thinking of this as an arrangement and started thinking of it as something else. And that is a terrifying thing to discover when you have spent 4 years deciding that love is a trap. The word fell into the room and sat there. Cornelius did not move for a long time. Then he said, "It is a trap." She looked up sharply. "It's a trap," he said again, "in the sense that once you're in it, there's no going back to being the person who wasn't. I know that. I've been walking the edge of it for 6 weeks myself, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise because I said I wouldn't pretend." He leaned forward on the table. "But Stella, you came here. You stepped off that stagecoach and you came here. And if you leave now, we'll both spend the rest of our lives wondering what was on the other side of afraid." The silence between them was the loudest thing in the room. She looked at him for so long that he felt the clock on the wall ticking against his pulse. "I need you to understand something," she said at last. "I am not easy. I have opinions and I express them. I will not be managed or dismissed. I have a dark past and an unpleasant marriage in my history, and those things have made me careful in ways that might look like coldness. And I am asking a great deal of you by staying, because staying means telling the truth the whole time, which is harder than leaving." "I know," he said. "You don't know yet. Then I'll find out." She looked at him for one more long moment. Then she reached down and picked up her travel bag from where she'd set it against the chair leg, held it in her lap for a second, and set it back down on the floor. She did not take it with her when they stood up. The weeks that followed were nothing like the careful, formal distance of the first 6. Something had been cracked open between them in that back room, and what came through the crack was both more complicated and more alive than either of them had planned for. Stella did not move into the cabin. The Reverend had found her a room with the Hutchins family, Dora and her husband William, for the period of acquaintance, and she stayed there. But she spent most of her days at the cabin now, not as a housekeeper in any servile sense, but as someone learning the shape of a life she was considering entering. She had opinions, as advertised. She told him the cabin's organization made no sense. The cooking tools were on the wrong side of the fireplace relative to where a person naturally stood while cooking. The firewood was stacked too close to the wall to be safe, and the sleeping area's single window faced east, which meant the morning light came in directly on the face of anyone sleeping there, and there was no way to prevent it without a curtain, which there wasn't. He listened to all of this. He moved the firewood. He made a curtain out of a piece of canvas he found in the barn. He did not move the cooking tools because he had a theory about their position that he explained at length. And she listened, and then said he was wrong, but she could see why he thought what he thought, and they reached a compromise that was actually better than either original arrangement. He discovered that she could read French well enough to read aloud from the one French novel he owned, a battered copy of Alexandre Dumas that had come west with him in 1865, and that her accent was imperfect but charming, and that she laughed at certain parts in a way that suggested she was reading more into the text than the literal translation. He asked her about this, and she gave him a look over the top of the book that made him feel warm in a way that had nothing to do with the fire. She discovered that he had been writing things down in notebooks for years. Not a diary, exactly, but observations. About the land, the animals, the weather, the people who passed through. They were written in the careful, close hand of a man who had taught himself to write better than he'd been taught. And they were occasionally beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when a person is not trying for beauty and achieves it accidentally. She read one page of one notebook which he had left on the table by accident and looked up at him and said, "You should not keep these in a cabin." "What should I do with them?" "Send them somewhere. A newspaper, a magazine." She set the notebook down with a precision that indicated she was being careful with it. "Someone should read these besides you." He had not known what to do with that. He had not known what to do with a great many things she said, because she had the specific gift of seeing things clearly and stating what she saw, which was a quality he admired and also found periodically destabilizing. The question of their arrangement sat over everything, acknowledged but not quite settled. Reverend Calhoun had gently indicated that the 6-week acquaintance period had technically elapsed, which meant they needed to make a decision. Cornelius was acutely aware of this without raising it, partly because the conversation in the back room at Eli Marsh's general store had shifted things enough that he was uncertain of the right approach, and partly because he had the mountain man's particular discomfort with speaking plainly about things that felt too large. It was Stella who raised it, on a cold November evening when they were sitting by the fire and she was reading and he was mending a piece of harness and the wind was doing what it always did in November in Wyoming, which was insisting loudly on being noticed. "Reverend Calhoun spoke to me this morning," she said, without looking up from her book. "I know," he said, and he put down the harness. "And I think you know what I want. I've thought you knew it for a while. But I'm also aware that what you want is the more important variable, given your history, and I didn't want to push." She lowered the book and looked at him across the fire. "Cornelius." "Yes. What do you want?" He met her eyes. "I want to marry you. I have wanted to marry you since approximately the third letter, and I have wanted it in a different and more specific way since the day you tried to leave, and I want it now in a way that I am struggling to be articulate about, which is unusual for me." He paused. "I also want to be clear that I know this is not a simple transaction, and that whatever we build together has to be something you chose fully, and I will not feel right about it otherwise. So I am telling you what I want and I am asking you what you want, and those are two different questions." She watched him for a long moment. "I want to stay," she said. "I want to stay and I want to stop being afraid of it, and I think the only way to stop being afraid of something is to stop running from it." She set the book down on the floor beside her chair. "I want to marry you if you'll take all the things I told you about. I told you I would. You should know it won't be without difficulty." "I don't want something without difficulty," he said. "I want something real." She smiled. It was the widest smile he had seen from her, and it changed her face completely, and he thought he might store the memory of that specific smile for the rest of his life, and it would still be worth the retrieval. "All right then," she said. They were married on the first Saturday of December, 1874, in Reverend Calhoun's church with Dora Hutchins and her husband William and Eli Marsh and his wife Clara and old Herschel Webb, and a handful of other residents of Cutter's Creek in attendance. The church was cold but well lit, because Clara Marsh had taken it upon herself to bring candles, and Stella wore her blue wool dress because it was the best thing she owned, and Cornelius wore his good shirt that still didn't fit his shoulders correctly. He slid a ring onto her finger that he had ordered from a catalog in September, before he knew she was planning to leave, which he recognized was a remarkable act of faith on his own behalf. She looked at the ring and then up at him and said very quietly so only he could hear, "You ordered this before?" "Yes, before the stagecoach office." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment and then she said, equally quietly, "That is possibly the most terrifying thing anyone has ever done for me." "I know," he said. "I mean it as a compliment." "I know that too." Reverend Calhoun cleared his throat meaningfully. When they said the words, she said them clearly and without hesitation, and he said them in a voice that was steady because he had decided it was going to be steady. And when the Reverend pronounced them married, Dora Hutchins cried enthusiastically enough for everyone in the room. Winter settled over the Medicine Bow Basin with the particular intensity of a Wyoming winter, which is to say completely and without apology. The temperature dropped to levels that were technically survivable but practically brutal, and the snow came down in the measured, relentless way that meant it was planning to stay. The cabin, which had been built for one person's solitude, adjusted itself around the presence of two people's company. They were careful with each other in the way of people who know that what they're building is fragile at first, before it sets, but careful in the active sense, the sense of paying attention, not careful in the sense of withholding. She had said she would be honest, and she was. He had said the same, and he kept to it. There were evenings of considerable warmth and mornings of considerable negotiation, and at least one afternoon in which they disagreed about something loudly enough that the mare in the barn expressed her opinion by kicking her stall, which broke both of their silences with a laugh that cleared the air entirely. He told her about the war. He had not talked about the war to anyone, had in fact structured his entire post-war existence around the strategic avoidance of talking about the war. But there was something about the combination of dark winters and Stella's quality of attention that made it feel possible. He told her carefully and in pieces, not all at once, but over the course of several evenings, and she listened in the way she did, without hurrying him or offering interpretations. And when he finished a difficult piece of it, she often said something quiet and true that didn't try to fix anything, because she understood, having her own dark history, that some things are not available for fixing and only need to be witnessed. He started writing more. She had said something should be done with the notebooks, and he found himself returning to that idea in a way he couldn't quite dismiss. He wrote longer pieces in the evenings, more shaped than the observation notes, things with beginnings and middles and a sense of what they were trying to say. He showed her one of them one January night, and she read it with the focused attention she brought to everything, and when she finished she set it down and looked at him. "You need to send this to Harper's Monthly," she said. "That seems like a considerable reach. Cornelius, I have read a great deal in my life. This is writing." She tapped the pages. "Send it." He sent it in February, wrapped in oilcloth against the weather, addressed to the editorial offices of Harper's new monthly magazine in New York, carried out by the mail rider who came through Cutter's Creek twice a month. He did not tell anyone else he had done it, partly from superstition, and partly because it was the kind of hope he needed to hold privately while it was still small. Spring came to the Wyoming basin the way it always did, with a grudging slowness that made each warm day feel earned. The snow pulled back from the lower elevations first, and then the creeks ran high and fast with melt, and the willows along the water began to show their first pale green. Cornelius went back to his trap lines, working them in the mornings and returning to the cabin in the afternoons, and Stella began a kitchen garden behind the cabin, working the ground methodically with a determination that he had come to understand was characteristic of how she approached any problem. She was happy. He could see it in her, not as a performed thing or a settled thing, but as something that was actively growing, the way the garden was growing, incrementally and with a certain focused energy. She talked more, she laughed more. She had made a genuine friend of Dora Hutchins, who came out to the cabin several afternoons a week, and the two of them had conversations that were clearly of considerable depth and substance, because whenever Dora left, Stella would bring a new idea to dinner. One of Dora's ideas, delivered through Stella, was that Cutter's Creek needed a school. There were 11 children of school age in the town and surrounding homesteads, and the nearest school was in Laramie, which was a hard 2 days' ride in good weather and essentially inaccessible in winter. Stella had the education and the temperament for teaching. Dora had the community connections. The idea arrived at the cabin as a suggestion and left as a plan, and within a month, Stella was teaching 5 mornings a week in the back room of Reverend Calhoun's church, which was the largest available space that could be heated reliably. She loved it with an intensity that surprised her. She came home those teaching mornings with a particular energy, words spilling out of her about something a child had said or a concept she had found a new way to explain or a problem she had solved with a piece of practical ingenuity. He listened to all of it with an attention that had its own quality of pleasure in it, the pleasure of watching someone discover something they were made to do. "You're good at this," he said one May evening. "I'm finding out that I am," she said. "That's a different thing." "Is it?" "Yes. One is a judgment from outside, the other is something you know from inside." She paused, cutting an apple with the small knife she kept on the kitchen shelf. "I haven't known many things from inside. I'm getting used to it." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. She looked down at their hands and then up at him, and the expression on her face was the one that still, after months, could stop him mid-thought. In June, a letter came from Harper's new monthly magazine. He recognized the return address and carried it from the mail in Cutter's Creek all the way home to the cabin without opening it, because he needed to open it somewhere that was his. He opened it at the table while Stella was in the garden. He read it twice. Then he sat for a long time in the chair with the letter on the table. When Stella came in, brushing soil off her hands, she read his expression before she read the letter. "What does it say?" she said. He looked up at her. "They want to publish it. And they want to know if I have more." She stood very still for a moment. Then she crossed the room and took his face in her soil-dirty hands and kissed him, which was the best response he could have imagined. And when she stepped back, her eyes were bright in the way that meant she was genuinely moved. "I told you," she said. "You did. You should write them back immediately." "I will. Today. Stella. Right now, Cornelius." He laughed, which was a thing he did with considerably more frequency these days than he had in the previous 9 years. And he sat back down at the table and pulled paper toward him and wrote to Harper's new monthly magazine while she stood behind him and read over his shoulder and occasionally suggested a word. Summer deepened and expanded in the way of Wyoming summers, which are short enough to feel precious and wide enough to be almost abundant. The garden produced more than they needed, and Stella began distributing the surplus to families in and around Cutter's Creek, a habit that required more trips to town and more conversations and more community than Cornelius had previously been in the practice of pursuing. He found that he did not mind. He had spent 9 years choosing solitude because it was simpler than people, and what he was discovering was that certain people, specifically his wife and the community she was building around her, were not simpler than solitude but were considerably better. Running Elk came through in August as he did every year, and this time Cornelius introduced him to Stella. The Arapaho trader was a man of perhaps 45, with a careful, observant intelligence that Stella matched instinctively, and the three of them spent an afternoon at the cabin in a conversation that moved between English and the smattering of Arapaho that Cornelius had acquired over years of trade. Stella asked Running Elk questions about the land and the seasons with the focused curiosity she brought to everything, and Running Elk answered them with the consideration of a man who appreciated good questions. And by the end of the afternoon, it was clear that they had established the foundation of a genuine respect. After Running Elk left, Stella was quiet for a while. "The land," she said finally, "has been used and managed by people for a very long time before any of us arrived here. I think most people who come west don't think about that enough." "No," Cornelius agreed, "they don't." "Does it trouble you?" He was quiet for a moment. "Yes, it has for a while. I don't know what to do with the trouble exactly except to acknowledge it and to treat the people I deal with as people, which is not very much but is at least a start." She nodded. "Running Elk doesn't need your acknowledgement, but he knows you see him. That's Running Elk's assessment to make." "Yes," she said. "I'm just reporting what I observed." He had, by then, submitted 3 more pieces to Harper's Monthly and received acceptance for 2 of them. The money was not large but was not nothing, and more than the money, there was the fact that his words were being read by people he would never meet, which was a strange and not unpleasant feeling. Stella sent the acceptance letters to her former employer, Mrs. Garrett, in Philadelphia, partly as a point of correspondence and partly, he suspected, as a kind of gentle vindication. In September, Stella told him she was expecting. She told him in the morning before he went out to check the traplines, sitting across the table from him with her coffee and her direct eyes and her habit of stating facts plainly. He was still for a long moment after she told him. "Are you all right?" she said. "I'm trying to locate the right word for what I'm feeling." "Take your time," he thought for a moment. "Grateful," he said at last. "That's the one." She smiled, and it was the wide, changing smile, the one he stored. "I'm frightened," she said honestly, "and happy, both of those things at once." "That seems right," he said. He reached across the table and she took his hand, and they sat there with the morning light coming through the new curtain over the east window and the smell of coffee between them, and neither of them needed to say anything more. The pregnancy was, as Stella herself described it, eventful. She was not a person who did things easily or without full engagement, and her body's adjustment to the pregnancy was consistent with her general approach to life, which was to do everything at full intensity. She was tired in the first months in a way that visibly frustrated her, because she did not like being limited, but she kept teaching, kept managing the cabin, kept corresponding with Mrs. Garrett and with 2 or 3 women in the territory whom she had developed friendships with through the school. She modified rather than stopped. Cornelius, for his part, found himself learning the specific skill of being useful without being solicitous. She did not want to be managed or hovered over, as she had made clear on multiple occasions, but there were things he could do quietly: the extra wood stacked closer to the door, the heavier tasks taken on without announcement, the evening meal ready when she came back from teaching, that were effective in the way that Stella's own approaches tended to be effective, which was practically and without fanfare. There was a cold night in December, almost exactly a year after their wedding, when the temperature dropped far enough to be genuinely dangerous, and the fire needed tending twice in the night, and he woke both times and tended it, and she woke the second time and found him sitting beside it. And they sat together for an hour in the dark warmth of the cabin with the wind outside and the fire between them, and she rested against his shoulder and he held her carefully. "I want you to know something," she said, in the particular soft voice she used in the middle of the night, different from her daytime voice. "What's that?" "I'm not afraid anymore," she said. "Of this, of us. I was afraid for so long that I thought it was a permanent condition, and somewhere in the last year it stopped." She paused. "I thought you should know." He pressed his lips to the top of her head. "I'm glad," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "I still have opinions about the cooking tools. I know. I want to be clear that the not being afraid doesn't change that. I never thought it would." She laughed softly in the dark, and he held her, and the fire burned warm against the cold outside. Their son was born in late February of 1876, delivered by the midwife who came out from Laramie at Cornelius's emphatic written request 2 weeks before the due date. The labor was long and difficult, and he spent a significant portion of it on the other side of the cabin door, in a state that he would later describe to no one, because he did not have words for how it felt to be that helpless when someone mattered that much. When the midwife opened the door and said, "Come in, Mr. Ramsey," he went through it, and Stella was sitting up against the headboard, exhausted and pale, but with her eyes clear and her expression composed in the way it was when she had done something very hard and come through it, and in her arms was the smallest person he had ever seen. "Come here," she said. He sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby into his arms with a care that transferred itself into his hands without instruction, and he looked down at this small face that was new in the world, and he felt something happen in the center of his chest that was beyond his existing vocabulary. "He's all right," he said. "He's perfectly all right," the midwife said from across the room, with the comfortable authority of a woman who had attended approximately 300 of these. "Strong as anything." He looked at Stella. "Are you all right?" "I'm tired," she said. "I'm extremely tired, but yes." She looked at the baby in his arms. "He has your jaw, poor thing." She laughed, which was the best sound he had heard in 12 hours, and leaned her head back against the pillow, and he sat on the edge of the bed with his son and the particular quality of the late February light coming through the east window, curtained now but still present at the edges, and thought that he had done nothing in his life that deserved this. They named the boy Henry, after Cornelius's father, who had been a hard and largely uncommunicative man, but had nonetheless worked himself to the bone to give his children an education, which Cornelius had decided in retrospect was a form of love. Stella wrote to Mrs. Garrett in Philadelphia to announce the birth, and Mrs. Garrett wrote back with warmth that indicated she was genuinely pleased. She also mentioned, in a postscript that Stella read to Cornelius with a complex expression, that the agency had placed 43 women in the preceding year, and that the letters she received from them made her believe that the West, difficult as it was, had given a great many of them something they had not been able to find in the East. She means something specific by that, I think, Stella said. What do you think she means? Room, Stella said. The East is very crowded, not just with people, with other people's ideas about who you are and what you should want. She set the letter down. Out here there's enough space that you can sometimes find out who you actually are. He looked at her across the table. Henry was sleeping in the cradle he had made from pine boards in December, and the morning light was coming in clearly, and she had flour on her hands from the bread she had been making when the letter arrived. "Did you find out who you actually are?" he asked. She considered the question with the seriousness she brought to everything. "I'm still finding out," she said. "But I have a much better idea than I did." She looked at him. "Did you?" "Yes," he said, "though some of the finding out required your assistance." She smiled. "I'll add it to your account." "What do I owe you?" She pretended to consider. "Continued honesty, regular firewood, the occasional translation help with the Dumas. That's all. And the knowledge that what you have here is real," she said more quietly. "Not an arrangement, not a transaction, real." "I know it's real, Stella." "So do I," she said. "That's the point. I know it now." The spring of 1876 brought changes to Cutter's Creek that had been coming for a couple of years. The railroad had reached Laramie, and while it would be several more years before it pushed further in their direction, the proximity of it was already pulling more settlers through the territory, more homesteaders and ranchers staking out land, more commerce moving along the roads. The town grew by a dozen families over the summer, and Stella's school grew accordingly, and she was no longer teaching in Reverend Calhoun's back room, but in a proper schoolhouse that William Hutchins and several other men had built in the early spring, the whole community turning out for the raising of it over 3 days in March. Cornelius's first piece had appeared in Harper's New Monthly magazine in April of 1875, and by the summer of 1876 he had published 7 pieces and was working on an 8th. The money from them had grown from modest to meaningful, enough that he had been able to put a proper wood floor in the cabin and add a second room to the back, which made the space more livable for 3 people and would, he and Stella had agreed, be useful going forward. He was still trapping and hunting, because the land and the work of it were part of him in a way that could not be removed, but the writing was becoming something that occupied an equal portion of his life, and he had begun to understand that the 9 years of notebooks, all those careful observations about the land and the weather and the animals and the people who passed through, were not just a private record but a body of work with a shape to it. And that the shape was of a man learning how to be present in his own life. Stella said as much when she read a draft of the 8th piece, which was the most personal thing he had written, a reflection on what he described as the years before. "This is different from the others," she said. "I know. You're in it more. I know that too. I think you should send it." She looked at him steadily. "I think someone will read it and feel less alone." He sent it. Harper's published it in January of 1877, and the response, letters to the editorial office, forwarded to him in a packet that arrived in Cutter's Creek in March, was larger than anything previous. People wrote about recognizing themselves in it, about the particular silence he had described, the one that is not peaceful but defensive, about the idea of coming out the other side. He read the letters one evening and then sat for a while and then went outside and stood in the cold March air and looked at the mountains. Stella came out after him. She stood beside him without saying anything, which was sometimes the most specific form of her attention. "There were a lot of letters," he said. "Yes, more than I expected." "I'm not surprised," she said. "That piece was hard to write." "I know. You told me to send it anyway." "I did." He looked at the mountains for another moment. "Thank you," he said. She took his arm. "Come inside. Henry will be up from his nap." He went inside. Henry, at 1 year old, was a person of considerable and vocal opinions, which did not surprise anyone who knew his parents. He had Cornelius's dark blonde hair and Stella's black eyes, which was a combination that created a particular intensity of expression, and he had already figured out how to make himself heard in a household of 2 adults who both had strong personalities and were capable of prolonged discussion. He had the mountain man's stubbornness and the letter writer's precision, which at 13 months of age expressed itself primarily as a strong preference for certain objects and a clear vocal objection to their removal. He was the great delight of both their lives, which was something neither of them said in exactly those words, but which was evident in approximately everything they did. The summer of 1877 brought an outbreak of fever to the territory, moving through the settlements along the Laramie River Valley and working its way north. 3 families in the Cutter's Creek area were affected, including the Hutchins family, and Dora was sick for 2 weeks in a way that was frightening enough that Stella essentially moved into the Hutchins house for the worst of it, leaving Henry with Cornelius and returning each evening exhausted and tight-faced with worry. Dora recovered. 2 other people in the wider community were not so fortunate. The fever passed by late July, leaving behind the particular silence that follows community loss. Stella came home from the last of her nursing duties at the Hutchins house and sat down at the table and was quiet for a long time, and Cornelius sat with her. "She could have died," Stella said at last. "She didn't. But she could have." She looked at her hands. "I keep thinking about what it would mean to lose her. Dora is—" She stopped. "She is one of the first genuinely good friends I have had since I was a girl. I don't have a large number of those." "I know," he said. "I feel as though I am always at the edge of losing things. As though the world is constantly on the verge of taking back what it gave." She looked up at him. "Is that something that goes away?" He thought about the honest answer. "I don't think it goes away entirely," he said, "but it quiets. The fear gets smaller relative to the life." He paused. "At least that's been my experience." She considered that. "That's what happened to me," she said slowly. "With the fear about us, it didn't disappear. It just got smaller than what was here." She made a small gesture that encompassed the cabin, the fire, the sleeping child in the next room. "Yes," he said, "something like that." She reached across and took his hand in both of hers, and he turned his hand over and held hers back, and they sat in the evening light and let the fear be small. In 1878, Cornelius was contacted by a publisher in New York who had read the Harper's pieces and wanted to know if there was a book. He wrote back that he did not know, which was honest. He talked to Stella about it over a long series of evenings, turning it over, testing the idea from different angles. "A book is different from a series of pieces," he said. "It has to be one thing." "What is the one thing?" she asked. He was quiet for a while. "The land," he said, "and what it asks of the people who come to it. What it changes in them, whether those changes are survivable." "Are they?" "I think so," he said. "I think that's the argument the book is making." "Then you know what it is," she said. "Write to the publisher." He wrote to the publisher. The writing of the book took most of 2 years. He wrote in the mornings before the traplines and in the evenings after Henry was in bed, in the expanding second room that Stella had quietly claimed as a proper study by putting a good desk in it, and a lamp with a glass chimney, and a shelf for the books that had accumulated from his reading and her own. It was, she told him, his space, and she respected that. But she also periodically stood in the doorway and asked how it was going in a way that kept him accountable to the work. She had her own writing by then. She had begun a correspondence with several women's organizations in Philadelphia and Chicago about the needs of women settling the Western territories, practical needs, education and medical access and legal standing, and the correspondence had grown into something more formal. A series of articles she contributed to a women's publication in Chicago under her own name. The articles were direct and factual and occasionally sharp, and they generated mail, which generated more correspondence. And by 1879, Stella Turner Ramsey was a name that meant something specific in certain circles that were concerned with the condition of women in the territories. She discussed all of this with Cornelius as a matter of course, because they discussed everything as a matter of course, which was the foundation the whole house stood on. He was proud of her in a way that he tried to express clearly, because she was not a person who needed approval, but she was a person who deserved acknowledgement. "The piece about the legal standing of married women in territorial law," he said one evening. "That was the strongest thing I've read in a long time." She looked up from her writing. "It's an outrage is what it is," she said. "A woman can work a homestead for 20 years and have no legal right to it in her own name. It's an injustice written into the structure of the thing." "Yes," he agreed. "What are you going to do about it?" She gave him a look that he had learned, over 5 years of marriage, to interpret as meaning that she had plans significantly beyond what she had so far described. "I am building a correspondence," she said. "Wyoming Territory has already given women the vote, which is more than anywhere else has managed. I want to know who made that happen and how, and whether it can be made to happen elsewhere for the other things as well. And then I am going to write a great deal of letters," she said simply. Henry, at 3, had a younger sibling. Their second child, a boy they named James after Stella's father, had arrived in the spring of 1878, with considerably less difficulty than Henry, which was a relief that Cornelius felt deep in his bones. James was quieter than his brother, a focused, watchful child who reminded Stella, in certain lights, of Cornelius as she imagined him before the mountains softened him. The two boys together were a particular variety of chaos that was also, undeniably, the best thing in the house. Henry talked constantly and James watched everything, and together they were comprehensively capable of doing whatever occurred to them, which kept both their parents in a state of engaged attention that was exhausting and wonderful. In the evenings, when both children were finally sleeping, Cornelius and Stella sat by the fire in the habit of 5 years, reading or writing or talking, and the silence between them when neither was doing anything in particular was the silence of people who are entirely comfortable in each other's presence, which is one of the best silences in the world. "Do you remember," she said one October evening, almost exactly 5 years after she had tried to leave, "what you said in the stagecoach office?" "I said several things. The one about what's on the other side of afraid." He looked at the fire. "I remember." "Were you right?" He looked at her. She was sitting in the chair she had come to occupy by long habit, the one on the south side of the fireplace, with a shawl over her shoulders and a book in her lap and the firelight on her face, and she was looking at him with the direct, honest eyes that had looked at him honestly for 5 years and had not once looked away from a difficult thing. "Yes," he said, "I was right." She smiled the wide smile. "So was I," she said. "I was afraid of this specifically, of this being real." She gestured at the room, the fire, the house, the sleeping children in the back room, of having this much to lose. And it is entirely worth the fear," she said. "Everything that is real is worth the fear of losing it. That's the trade." He thought about the furs, all those mornings on the trapline, all that cold and labor stored and traded for a different kind of life. He thought about the letter on Herschel Webb's notice board. He thought about the 7 letters on the shelf above the fireplace, which were still there, moved from shelf to shelf as the cabin had grown but always kept. "Yes," he said, "that's the trade." The book was published in the autumn of 1880 by a house in New York under the title The Long Winter and After, which was Stella's suggestion. The advance had been enough to put a real addition on the cabin, turning it into something that could properly be called a house, with a proper kitchen and 3 bedrooms, and a sitting room with windows that faced the mountains. The publication itself brought a kind of attention that was new and slightly uncomfortable, letters from readers and occasional mentions in Eastern publications, which Stella handled with the same organizational efficiency she brought to everything. She had by then her own correspondence so extensive that she had organized it into a filing system that occupied half of the study, and she wrote with a regularity and purpose that was producing real effects. Wyoming Territory's legal protections for women were a matter of ongoing correspondence and advocacy that connected her with women working on the same questions in Colorado and Nebraska and beyond. She was not famous exactly, but she was known and effective, which was better. Cornelius was trapping less and writing more. The land still asked for him in the mornings, and he still went out, but the traplines were shorter now, more for the practice than the revenue. Running elk came through in the autumn of 1880, and for the first time in several years he brought his family, his wife and 2 daughters, and they spent 2 days camped on the creek below the house. And the exchange of that visit was warm enough that Stella and Running Elk's wife found a shared language of practical wisdom that crossed the barrier of vocabulary through gesture and demonstration, and the particular communication of women who both know what real work looks like. Henry, at 5, was beginning to learn to read. Stella taught him in the kitchen mornings with a focused patience that was something to witness, firm and consistent, and refusing to accept less than what she knew he was capable of. And Henry, who had inherited a considerable portion of stubbornness from both his parents, matched her exactly and was reading simple sentences by Christmas. James, at 2.5, was already taking after his brother in the enterprise of figuring out how things worked, which in the practical domestic environment meant a succession of incidents involving objects not intended for the purposes to which they were applied. Cornelius dealt with these as they arose with the equanimity of a man who had survived 9 years alone in the mountains and was not going to be undone by a 2-year-old, though he also acknowledged privately that the 2-year-old represented a category of challenge the mountains had not quite prepared him for. Stella, watching him deal with James, had on more than one occasion an expression that she did not try to conceal, which was the expression of a person watching something they love be exactly what it is. In December of 1880, almost exactly 6 years after their wedding, there was a letter. It came in the mail packet with the Harper's correspondence and several letters for Stella and a notice from the land office, and it was addressed to Cornelius in a hand he did not recognize, with a return address in Missouri. He opened it at the table after supper, and Stella across from him watched his face change. "What is it?" she said. He looked up from the letter. "It's from a woman named Margaret Halsey," he said. "She says she read the book." He paused. "She says she is my sister." Stella put down her pen. "I have a sister," he said. "She was 6 when I left home for the war in 1862. I was 18. I did not go back after." He was quiet for a moment. "I told myself there was no one left to go back to. My father died in 1866. I found that out from a neighbor's letter. My mother in 1868. I had a sister, but I did not." He stopped. "I told myself she would have made her own life. I did not look." Stella said nothing. She was watching him in the particular way she watched things that required careful attention. "She read the book," he said. "She recognized the mountains. She recognized." He folded the letter slowly. "I wrote about my father in the book, the way he worked. She recognized him from the description. Cornelius." He looked at her. "Write her back tonight," she said. He wrote back that night, sitting in the study at the desk she had given him, with the lamp burning and the house quiet around him. He wrote a long letter, longer than he planned, because once he started there was a great deal to say, and he found that the practice of honesty in one direction had made it easier in all directions. He told Margaret about the cabin, the marriage, the boys, the writing. He told her he was sorry for the years of silence. He told her he would like to know her again if she was willing. He sealed the letter and put it in the mail on the next writer's run, and he and Stella did not talk about it extensively after that, because there was nothing useful to say yet. But she reached across the table that night and took his hand, briefly and without comment, in the way she had of making large gestures through small ones. Margaret Halsey wrote back in January. She was married, living in Springfield, Missouri, with 3 children. She had not known where her brother was but had never entirely stopped looking, had read the book twice and recognized enough to write to the publisher. Her letter was warm and slightly careful, the letter of a woman who had learned not to expect too much too fast but who was clearly glad. The correspondence between them grew slowly over the following year, carefully, the way the garden grew, but with a direction that was unmistakably positive. By the summer of 1881, there was a plan for Margaret and her family to come west in the following spring, to visit Cutter's Creek and the house and the mountains and the nephews she had not yet met. Stella read his letters to Margaret sometimes with his permission, and occasionally contributed a paragraph of her own at the end, which Margaret responded to with warmth and curiosity. And by the time the visit was actually arranged, Margaret had written to Stella almost as much as to Cornelius, and Stella had said, reading one of Margaret's letters, "I think I'm going to like her." "You're going to recognize each other," Cornelius said. "What does that mean?" "She has your quality," he said, "of seeing things directly." Stella looked at the letter in her hand and then at him. "That might be the most specific compliment you have ever given me," she said. "I've been practicing," he said. She laughed, and he thought about all the mornings on the trapline and all the cold and all the accumulated patience of those years, traded for this specific sound in this specific kitchen on a winter evening, and he thought that every pelt had been more than worth it. That winter, in the slow evenings between Christmas and the New Year, Stella found him in the study one night and sat in the chair she kept in the corner for when she came to read while he wrote, and did not say anything for a while. He kept writing until he reached a natural pause and looked up. "I was thinking about the letter," she said. "Which one?" "My last letter to you, from the agency. The one you said something about in the stagecoach office, about the third letter being the one that changed things for you." She was looking at the lamp rather than at him. "I've been thinking about which letter it was for me." He put down his pen. "It was your third letter too," she said. "You wrote about the mountain in February. You wrote about the specific quality of morning light on snow at high elevation, and how there is a point when the cold becomes something other than a sensation and becomes something closer to a state of being. You wrote about it very precisely, very carefully, and I read it and I thought," she paused. "I thought, this man actually sees things. Not the way most people see, where seeing is just registering. He sees the way you see when you are paying real attention." She looked at him. "That was when I stopped being a professional correspondent and started writing to you as myself." He was quiet for a long moment. "The third letter," he said. "Yes. I wrote that one in 2 drafts," he said. "The first draft was too short. I kept feeling like there was more to say." "There was," she said. "I'm glad you said it." He got up from the desk and crossed the small room and sat in the other chair, the one opposite hers, and took her hand and held it. She leaned her head back and looked at the ceiling and then at him, and the lamplight was warm between them. "Stella," he said. "Yes. I want you to know something." She smiled slightly. "Take your time." "The furs," he said. "The whole season's worth, all of that trapping in the cold." He held her hand firmly. "I would do it again. I would do 10 seasons. I would have trapped until I had no mountain left." He looked at her steadily. "You have been worth every single one." She was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough that he could hear the fire in the other room and the wind beginning to come off the mountains. Then she said, very softly, "That is an extremely romantic thing for a mountain man to say." "I've been practicing that too," he said. She laughed, and it filled the small room completely, and he held her hand in the lamplight. Margaret Halsey and her family arrived in Cutter's Creek in the spring of 1882 on the stagecoach from Laramie, almost exactly 8 years after Stella had stepped off a similar coach for the first time. Cornelius stood at the stagecoach office. It had been rebuilt with proper plank walls since Gerald Prout retired, and waited, and when the coach arrived and a woman stepped down who had his jaw and his eyes in a different feminine arrangement, he felt something settle into place that had been loose for a very long time. Margaret Halsey looked at him and said, "You look older than your letters." He said, "You look exactly like I remember you at 6, which is not the compliment you might think." She laughed and hugged him, and it was the specific, bone-deep awkwardness of family affection that has been absent too long to be fully natural yet. But the quality of it was unmistakably right. Stella stepped forward and Margaret looked at her and said, very directly, "You are exactly what your letters suggested." Stella said, "So are you. I meant it as a compliment." Margaret said, "So did I," and then they were talking with the ease of people who have been corresponding for over a year and have got to know each other through careful, honest words. And Henry and James were examining Margaret's 3 children with the frank curiosity of small boys. And Cornelius stood in the bright spring morning and looked at the scene in front of him and felt, for the second time, entirely grateful. The visit lasted 3 weeks, and it was 3 weeks of considerable noise and full meals and late evenings and conversations that covered ground from the war to the mountain to the book, to the women's advocacy work to what life was like in Missouri versus Wyoming, and a dozen other things. Margaret's husband, a solid and decent man named Arthur who liked Cornelius on the basis of being similarly quiet in a house full of people with strong personalities, fit easily into the household. The children played and bickered and played again with the uninhibited social efficiency of childhood. On the last evening of the visit, after the children were all in bed and Arthur had fallen asleep in the chair by the fire, Margaret and Stella and Cornelius sat at the kitchen table with the last of the coffee. "You'll come back," Stella said. It was not a question. "Probably every 2 years," Margaret said, "if that suits." "More often if you can," Cornelius said. Margaret looked at him. "You were gone a long time," she said. "I was. I'm not interested in making you pay for it. You should know that." "I know," he said. "I'm still sorry." "I know you are," she said. "That's enough." She looked between him and Stella. "I'm glad you found each other. I want you to know I can see what you have. It's a good thing." The table was quiet for a moment. "It is," Stella said. They saw Margaret and her family off on the stagecoach with promises and a letter already composing itself in Stella's head that she would begin writing that afternoon. The dust of the coach settled on the Cutter's Creek Main Street, and Cornelius and Stella stood and watched it diminish to the south, and Henry stood beside his mother with his hand in hers, and James sat on his father's shoulders, the way he preferred to see the world. "All right," Stella said. "All right," Cornelius agreed. They walked back through town together, greeting people as they passed, because they both knew everyone and everyone knew them. Cornelius, the writer-trapper whose book had made it to the Eastern papers, and Stella, the teacher and advocate whose name was being cited in correspondence with the territorial legislature. Eli Marsh waved from the general store. Dora Hutchins, very much recovered from her illness of 5 years ago, and now the informal mayor of Cutter's Creek in all but title, called something from across the street that made Stella laugh. That evening, after the boys were in bed and the house was settled, Stella came to find Cornelius in the study where he had already started writing. "What are you working on?" she said. "A new piece," he said, "for Harper's." "What is it about?" He paused, looking at the page. "It's about the idea of arriving somewhere," he said. "How a place becomes yours. How the becoming happens slowly through specific things, weather and work and the particular quality of the people you find there." She stood in the doorway for a moment. "That's a good subject," she said. "I think so." "Is it about here?" "Yes," he said. "It's about here." She came in and stood behind him and read what was on the page, and he let her, because he always let her, because she was the best reader he knew, and because there was nothing about his work or his life that he wanted to keep hidden from her. "This is good," she said. The third sentence, she leaned over and pointed, and they discussed the third sentence for several minutes with the engaged precision they brought to each other's work. Then she straightened up and put her hand briefly on his shoulder and said, "I'll let you write." "Stella." She paused in the doorway. "I love you," he said. He said it with the direct simplicity of a man who has learned that the most important things are usually the plainest, that all the beautiful long sentences in the world are decoration, and the thing itself is short. She looked at him across the study, past the lamp and the desk and the books and the 7 letters that had moved from shelf to shelf over the years and were now on the shelf above the window. "I love you too," she said. "I have for quite a while." "Since the 3rd letter," he said. "Since around then," she agreed. "I just didn't know the name for it yet. And now I know exactly what it is," she said. "It's this, exactly this." She went back to the kitchen, and he turned back to the page, and the house held them both in the specific warmth of a life that had been built carefully and honestly, and was still being built, day by day, letter by letter, year by year, out of the accumulated material of 2 people who had decided that the only thing harder than trusting someone was living without having done it. The mountains stood outside, exactly as they had always stood, indifferent to human time. The fire in the kitchen burned warm. The boys slept in the room at the back of the house, growing in the dark the way children do, becoming themselves. Cornelius wrote. Outside, the Wyoming wind came down off the high slopes and ran across the basin and found the house and moved around it, as wind always does, looking for a way in and finding none. The house held. It had been built to hold.